Hey y'all, I'm James Wright, and welcome to my dining room. Today we're making a clock from a cookie. Let's dive in. This is a hard maple cookie. It's a little over 2 foot in diameter. Actually, I think it's like 28 inches in diameter. And it is hard maple, all end grain. And with a low angle plane, you can do this. It's a lot of work though. I want to make this thing flat, and that means at one end I need to take off 2 inches of wood here. 2 inches of planing. 2 inches of a very repetitive work. And yes, I could do that, but at some point you realize that's kind of dumb. So, yeah, let's try something a little bit different. I bought a router bit, and this is actually something that's designed to go in a power tool, not in a hand router. Yes, that means I'm going to be using power tools here, because sometimes it's just wise to do that. And I made up a jig, and this is a flattening jig out of 2x6s. So you can see how the 2x6s are screwed together as a T, and then I've supported the cookie and then run it through. And the nice thing with this bit is you can take a fairly heavy cut pretty easily with the end grain. I'm going to start by taking some very light passes just to test it and see where it's at. And currently I'm where they're working, and it's -10, I think. It's a pretty cold day. So that's why I'm wearing gloves. Usually I'm not going to wear gloves with power tools, but I basically had to in order to make this work. So we're going to start doing this. Nice thing about it is you can very easily lower the bit down just a little bit more and keep on going. And that way you can take it off bit by bit. Especially with having to take off 2 inches, I'm going to have to adjust it at some point. So we're going to go until one side is flat. And then we're going to flip it over and then flatten the other side until that side is where I want it to be. And then we're going to flip it back over and do a finishing cut on the first side. Now, I was originally trying to save the bark on this, but at the time of year it was cut down, it's just not going to stay on there. And you can see how it's chipping off in many different places. And we ended up deciding to actually get rid of the bark eventually, so I'm not worrying about that too much. I have planks going between the 2 stretchers, and then I can just put screws on the side to keep it from sliding around. And there's the cookie. It came out to just shy of 2 inches thick. And we want to put a clock into the back of this. So I have this clock mechanism. Now this is actually a heavy-duty clock mechanism. It's designed for larger arms. So if you want something like this with a larger face, you need to make sure that it can handle that, as well as this one will handle the larger pendulum we have on there. So I want to recess it in because it can only have a maximum of 1/4 inch to the shank. So I need to actually recess this down in so that the rotating piece, the fulcrum, can stick out the other side of the clock. So we need to cut out a mortise on the back of this. And the easiest way to do that is to take out the majority of it with a bunch of holes and then chisel out the rest. And this is a very slow and tedious process. But the nice thing about having this depth stop is I can keep it the exact same every time, and I can get a very clean bottom to it. Now, when chiseling this out with the end grain, you have to be incredibly careful because every one of these is going to want to split out, and it's just going to break off the bottom. And so I'm just taking off a little bit by little bit and trying to weaken all the pieces before then chopping them out. And this was getting incredibly tedious. I ended up just using the router and coming down into it. I'll show you a little bit about that in the future here. Just because I only have one of these cookies, and if I make one slight mistake, it's going to ruin this whole thing. And I'm doing this for a friend, and so it's not something I can do that's, okay. I want to make it to fit all the way down in there so that it will stick out the front side. And so that means a little bit of wiggling here and there. I took out the majority with the router and drill bits, but then we can come in and clean it all out and make sure it slides all the way down in. I also want to make an escape here for the pendulum because I want it to swing back and forth across the crack here. But that means we need to take out a little bit more material. And this one, even more than the middle, I need to be very careful with that because it would be incredibly easy to just split out chunks of this because it's all end grain. One slight split and the chisel would just destroy this. Surprisingly, the router is actually the safer option here. The power router will take it out far more accurately and far more safely. Which is a very rare thing to say with power tools, but it's going to be much safer on the project. So, yeah. So now you can see how it fits through there. and the pendulum will then swing and it passes by the crack so you can see it going back and forth. This is something we I was really happy to do this once we saw how it came out. However, all the pieces are silver and black, and we want to do something a little bit different, so I'll be covering that here in a bit here. Now, we roughed it out with the router, but that means there's all these tracks, and it just doesn't look very good. So I'm going to bring in the low-angle jack and take off a few shavings on this, and I'm actually going to take off quite a bit, so it's a pretty heavy shaving. And then we'll come in with a card scraper and really detail it out. And here you can see I'm flipping the card scraper over and over because I'm getting all this dust. And then I grabbed a different card scraper and I was still getting dust. And I grabbed a different one, and then finally I found one that was sharp. I keep like 7 or 8 of them, and I sharpen them all at the same time rather than just sharpening one at a time like I should. So I usually end up playing through 4 or 5 of them until I find one that's actually sharp. But once you have a card scraper, with this end grain, it goes incredibly fast. You can take off a decent amount of work and give yourself a really clean surface. So for this, the last thing to touch it is the card scraper. I printed off all these letters, and I printed off them a couple different sizes until I found the size that I wanted. Made radius out, and then decided to put this on here. Now, normally I would draw a circle a certain distance out from the middle, and then put them all on the inside and the outside of that circle. But in this case, I wanted it to follow the natural outside edge of the cookie. And so each one is at a slightly different distance from the middle, making it a little bit more organic in that feel. Just something different to play with. But normally you would draw a circle out from the middle and then put them all on that circle so that all the letters are equal distance out from the middle. For the letters, I'm actually going to carve them in and then fill them in with a little bit of epoxy coloring just to give them that little bit of look. For the chisel work, I'm actually going to be doing I think I did all of this with the bench chisel. I didn't use any of the carving chisels. And it's doing chip carving. So I'm going to come in from one side at like 30 degrees or so, and then I'll come in from the other side at around 30 degrees or so, and hopefully those two V's will meet in the bottom. Now, because I'm going to be filling this with a colored epoxy, I don't really worry about it because you're not going to be able to see the wood through the epoxy. But take your little time and be very, very careful, but the end grain does actually cut pretty well, even though it is hard maple. This was something I had to keep these chisels sharp. I kept a strop on the bench to clean them off. I put them down with a simple glue stick. I really like this method because it holds them very well. Most other methods, I just haven't found something that holds really well. I've done the super glue and the painter's tape, and I just don't like it very well. The nice thing about this is usually the next thing you're going to do is grab a card scraper and do the finishing on the wood. And the card scraper takes the paper off beautifully. So I like doing that. Now we're going to put on the first coat of shellac, but in this case, all I'm going to be doing is filling the letters. I want the epoxy to fill in the spaces, but I don't want it to spill over and then fill in all of the grain on this. Now, this is end grain, and so any of the epoxy is going to fill that up and color it in. Now, while we're doing that, we're going to spray paint all the pieces, and I'm going to use an etching primer on this because some of it is still metal and some of it's plastic, and I just wanted something that would give me a good base coat to put all the color on all of them. Later on, we're going to come back and paint them all. So to fill in the letters, we're going to put in some epoxy. I'm using Total Boat High Performance, and then I'll add some pigment to it. And I'll leave a link to these down below. It's a set that I got years ago, and I've been slowly marking my way through it, and it'll probably last me for another decade. Just a little bit of pigment here and there. It's going to be mostly black with a bit of speckle in it, just makes it shine. Just a little bit of something to make it pop out rather than just being flat black. Mix it, mix it, mix it, mix it, and then you can put it in. And because we shellacked these, the epoxy isn't going to soak down into the wood. All the pores have been already filled with the epoxy. And then any epoxy that runs over the edge is not going to then pour into the end grain of the wood, because if you don't do the shellac, the epoxy will fill into that end grain, and you'll start to get these leaks that after you go to finish it, you'll have this blotchiness around the letters. And I've run into that a few in the past, and now whenever I do carved infills, I always hit them with some shellac, a really heavy shellac. So let's go back to these parts, and I'm going to be using this metallic spray. It's the textured paint, and I really like it. It just adds a little bit more to it, and it will match the speckle that's in the letters. I played with originally doing it with the black items to match the black letters, or to do both gray, and I actually like the dichotomy of the gray hands to the black letters. No, it's a very personal taste, but that's what I found to be most intriguing. Once that's all done, we can scrape off all the excess epoxy, and then we can turn our attention back to the bark that was on here. Whew! So most of this, about half of it broke off in the test work, and I just came back through and chiseled off what was on there. This is a dull draw knife, and I'm actually using it to peel off some of the extra on there, but I want to leave some of it on there just to add that color difference. So you have the right underneath the sap into the first ring of actual sapwood. And so we're going to clean it all down to a matching color across, but then come in with the spoke shave and round over the front edge of the cookie. And so we're going to give this a nice softened edge. And the spoke shave will get it really close, but because we're finishing it all with a card scraper, I'm going to come in and finish the rounded edge with the card scraper as well. And even though it's in grain, it still does really, really well. So you can see how the dull will get under some of it, but it won't actually carve into the wood, and it won't hit the really hard wood underneath. It's basically just hitting and cleaning off the bark that wants to fall off. Card scraper will start at one angle and then roll it over to the other angle until we get a nice rounded edge. On the inside here, there was a lot of fuzz and just little things I wanted to get rid of before actually doing the finishing. Card scraper, the card scraper for some of it, but the chisel for most of it. And then for some of it, I did even come in with a file and just rub off any of the fuzzes and things that were sticking in there. Little details like this are what really make it. I wanted to keep this rough so you could tell that it was a natural crack, but I wanted to clean it up a little bit. Now let's actually get on to the finishing. We're going to be hitting this with a full strength shellac all the way around on all sides. And this will, again, fill in all of the pores. And with all of this being in grain, it will just soak this up. So I'm not worried about this full strength shellac having any problems on there or building up. It will all get sucked down into this wood. And it's amazing how fast it just pulled it out and the brush was suddenly dry. So all surfaces get one coat of full strength shellac. And then we're going to dilute it down to about a 2-pound cut. And this will make it much, much thinner. One of the problems with shellac is it's very easy to overbuild the surface, and you start to get this plastic look on top of it, and it's not very good. You want to have a finish that's protected. You want something that will seal the wood, but you don't want this coat of epoxy on top of it. Before going any farther, we're going to hit it with a very light 400 grit. And this, you'll see it build up all of this dust, and you can get most of this dust off with a tacky cloth. I actually like to use a little bit of alcohol on a rag, and that will absorb the dust, but it will also dissolve the dust so it doesn't spread out as much. Here I have the 2-pound cut, and we're going to come in and start wiping this on. I have a total of 5 coats that I'll put on with the 2-pound cut, and then I sand in between every other coat. So not between every coat, but I'll do 2 coats and then sand, and 2 coats and then sand, and then one final light coat on top of it all. And that will bond it in, and you get this really nice glossy finish on there. But it's a little bit too heavy of a gloss, and so I'm actually going to be using my homemade paste wax. I'm not going to polish it down to a buffed glossy surface. I want it to be a little bit matte, not totally, but just enough to make it not epoxy looking. So for this, we're going to apply the paste wax rather liberally, let it dry, and then we're going to come back in with a rag and buff it out. This is going to then take off the excess paste wax and leave what it just fills the pores and cracks underneath. And we want to make sure we do this to all surfaces so that we get a nice even coat all the way around, and we're not going to have expansion and contraction problems. Then it's time for the assembly, and the clock piece will then fit in, and there is a retaining nut that goes on the other side to hold it in place. Now, normally this is actually designed to be hung from this actual mechanism. There's a bracket that comes with it, but that's not going to hold up this whole cookie. It's designed for something a lot lighter. So in this case, I'm going to drill in 2 screws, and we're going to use this stop so that I go in specifically a distance without coming out the other side. And then the screws have very large washers on it. I want to put a wire going back and forth between these 2 nuts. And this way I can very easily adjust the balance of the clock and make sure that it's hanging perfectly. I want that pendulum to be swinging exactly across that crack. I'm also going to be using a Nyco-press to crimp these down in. It's a lot bigger than I need for this because I'm using a tiny wire and I'm just running it back and forth. That's just going to pinch it in place so it doesn't slide around. Then we can put these screws down a little bit more, lock this down in, get rid of the excess wire, crimp that down on, and now I have a hanging wire that I can easily adjust this whole thing on, and it's strong enough to hold the weight of this whole cookie. Now, I ran into a problem with the hands running into each other, but that's because they're designed to be twisted just a little bit so they don't run into each other and catch on each other. So a little bit of work, that's it. And we can hang this up, and you can see with the wire, it will allow me to adjust exactly how it hangs, going back and forth until a little too far, and then back the other way a little too far until it hangs with a crack vertical. And now the pendulum will swing and will pass through that crack, making it visible. And I really like that piece of it. This was something that really came out well, and I hope my friend enjoys it, and their family will have many, many years to have it in their house. So this one was a bit challenging, but kind of a fun experiment for me. A friend of mine had a maple tree in their yard, lopped it down, and had a couple cookies, and she wanted me to make something from them. So we thought about making the traditional table, but this was a little bit more different. So we thought this would be a good challenge. Normally I would draw a circle and then put all the letters on that circle from an even space out from the middle. But in this case, I thought I would make the circle the natural figure of it and off-center it with the heart of the tree. I kind of like it. It was a bit of an experiment. I might try a few things a little bit differently because it kind of spaces some of the letters out in odd ways, but I actually kind of like how it came out. So yeah, there's 1,000 things I could do differently on this. Working with ingrain is very, very hard, especially when it gets really, really thin. If you do anything wrong, you're going to be chipping out pieces. And so that's a time when power tools really are the best method. They're not just the most efficient. They are the method that will give you the best result. And yes, I could do it all with hand tools, but yeah, there are times when power tools are the way to go. Especially when working with the thin ingrain woodwork. This was a place where those really shine and did very well. So I'm very happy with how it came out. I might do something different like this in the future. I'm thinking about doing one with wooden gears, and there's a lot of fun things I could do with that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, ideas, snide remarks. Throw them in the comments down below. I do read through all of them, and I answer as many as I possibly can. So thank you for that. That really does help out the channel. And a great way you can help out the channel is becoming a patron on Patreon or clicking the little join button and becoming a member. That is the best way to keep this channel going, because without patrons and members, this channel wouldn't exist. So thank you for that. And if you want to find a way that doesn't require money, just click that like button. That really does help out. The algorithm is very important to keeping this channel going. So I think that'll do it for now. And until next time, have a wonderful day. Hickory dickory dock. The power tool ran about the clock.